Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining Southface Institute's Sustainability in Action Roundtable, or START, as we like to call it, on financing the transition to a regenerative economy. I'm Catherine Slocum-Samua, your host today. We are so glad you've joined us. Next slide. If you're having technical difficulties, click on the Raise Your Hand icon on the left side of your GoToWebinar control panel. Next. Feel free to ask questions for the panelists at any time using the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Your questions will be passed on to our moderator for the Q&A session later today. Next. You can use the hashtag SouthfaceStart on social media to connect with other START attendees and share links to other upcoming sustainability events. Next. Did you attend a START in 2020 or 2021 and need continuing education credits from the American Institute of Architects? Then email events@southface.org with your name, AIA number, and the STARTs that you have attended. Hopefully we can get you those CEUs. Next slide. Did you know that Southface is a member-supported environmental and community development nonprofit? Becoming a Southface member is a great way to connect with other sustainability professionals and receive discounts on courses, events, and CEUs. When you become a member, you help us fulfill our mission of building a low-carbon, regenerative economy that embodies responsible resource use, social equity, and a healthy built environment for all. Before we start the program, let's do a quick poll to gauge what member benefits you're most interested in and are important to you. Feel free to answer if you're a current member or if you're not a member at all. All right, I think we're going to close up the poll. Okay, networking events. Great, you guys care about our mission. That's great to hear. Discounts. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for everyone for completing the poll. And because you guys are so engaged, we are going to be giving away a Southface professional membership. As you can see, the benefits of being a member are on the page now, on the screen now. Next slide, please. If you would like to be entered to win this prize, type #member in the questions box and hit send. I will announce the winner at the end of the event. Good luck. Next slide. To kick off the program, we will hear from one of our 2021 corporate donors. Please welcome Matt Ross, President of EcoSmart. First, we'll watch a video from EcoSmart and then Matt will speak.
Homeowners, commercial building owners, and contractors looking for high efficiency, healthy, disaster-resistant construction materials for their projects need only come to us, EcoSmart, to meet all their needs. We are a one-stop green construction supply source, unique in the industry. EcoSmart offers the broadest variety of environmentally conscious materials for both new construction and retrofits. We've been providing best-in-the-business products and services since 1993. Metal structural insulated panels provide hurricane, seismic, fire, pest, mold-resistant, energy-efficient construction. These panels are cost competitive and faster to build with, creating disaster-resistant, healthy buildings. Additionally, energy usage reduction between SIPs and conventionally built structures typically reaches 30 to 50% monthly utility savings. Next up, in LED lighting retrofits, we offer lamps from 3 watts to 500 watts, replacing virtually any conventional light at 50 to 75% savings. We even offer LED turtle-friendly lamps for coastal applications. Other EcoSmart products include let EcoSmart save you money while providing better performing solutions for your construction and remodeling needs. Healthy, efficient, disaster-resistant products for better living.
Hi, I'm Matt Ross. I'm president and founder of EcoSmart. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Started the company in 1993, and a year later, the Florida House Learning Center opened. I learned about it on Earth Day and was, at the time, my company was called Energy Conservation Products, just doing primarily energy efficient lighting. but I met the founders of the Florida House Institute in '94, and they convinced me to, well, inspired me really to expand to become this one-stop green construction supply company, which I've enjoyed for 28 years. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to introduce my company, and look forward to working with Southface very closely in Sarasota.
Thank you so much, Matt. We're so glad you're able to be here and join us and be a sponsor of Southface.
My pleasure.
Next slide, please. So Southface sponsors help us provide meaningful and relevant content. So if you would like to be a sponsor, you or your company, please reach out to me if you're interested. You can put it in the chat box, or you can email me at development@southface.org to sponsor our next start. And now I'll hand it over to Shane Totten, Southface Institute's Director of Strategy and Impact. He will talk more about the importance of a regenerative economy and introduce our moderator. Welcome, Shane. Shane, we can't hear you. You might be muted.
I think that's the phrase of 2020 and 2021 is you're muted. Hey y'all, thanks for joining us this morning at the May SART. Today's focus is on financing the regenerative economy. And as you may know, we here at Southface Institute have been focusing on demonstrating real-world examples of regenerative economies. And in contrast to a linear economy that thrives on the concept of take, make, use, and dispose, or a circular economy that's focused on re-engaging resources over time, a regenerative economy aims to regenerate capital assets, giving back more than it takes, and creating accessible potential for people. So for this month's Sustainability in Action Roundtable, we're going to examine some financial tools that are currently available that support the transition to a regenerative economy. From carbon credits that are generated by forests and building products to solar energy agreements and green revolving funds and banks, there are many public and private sector financial products that are available to empower this transition that we need. So for today's discussion, I'm pleased to introduce John Fullerton. He's an unconventional economist, an impact investor, a writer, and some have said a philosopher. Building on and integrating the work of many, he's the architect of regenerative economics, which he outlined in his 2015 booklet, Regenerative Capitalism: How Universal Patterns and Principles Will Shape the New Economy. He's the founder and president of the Capital Institute, which aims to reimagine our economic and financial systems to promote a transformation to a more just and regenerative world. For the next hour, we're going to hear from John, as well as Southface's own Barry Coates, our Chief Officer of Finance and Operations, Matthew Hickman, an investment associate at DC Green Bank, and Susan Kidd, the Executive Director of the Center for Sustainability at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. So thank y'all for joining us today.
Thank you, Shane, and good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm particularly delighted with the framing around regenerative economy, something that I'm very passionate about. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes or a little more framing our conversation this morning, and then as Shane mentioned, we've got three great colleagues of mine who are going to be joining me in a discussion and sharing a bit about their work, putting theory into practice on the ground. So I've got a few slides to keep me on task. If we could get those started, that'd be great. It's amazing how we've all gotten used to talking to our computers. So financing a transition to a regenerative economy is the topic. Next slide. As I mentioned, I'd like to just put this moment into some context, and not to get into the doom and gloom slides, but we are undertaking to transform the economic system to one that actually works for people and the planet. And in complexity science, when a system shifts, it shifts in response to pressure. That's what causes systems to shift. And so we have a system that is under accelerating pressure. That's both the good news and the bad news. The good news is that it will change. And it's our task, I think, at this moment, meaning in our lifetimes, to ensure, next slide, please, that we don't shift out of the relatively placid Holocene, where temperatures are in a special zone that allows life on this planet to continue to exist as we've seen it. And I would say we're reaching that upper edge of the critical boundary with temperatures rising literally and metaphorically, but also many other pressures, biodiversity loss, desertification in particular, are forcing us to change the way our economic system operates, because our economic system is the way humanity and human culture interact with the biosphere. Next slide, please. So what I would propose is that we're sitting here in really a truly historic moment. We've had all of the advances of modern age scientific advances, and yet at the same time we're threatening the underlying living systems and biospheric function that enables humanity and all other living systems to thrive. And so many people are talking about the dawn of an integral era, the way we reconnect both ourselves with each other and ourselves with the planet we call home in a much more holistic and integrated fashion. And I think that is what's happening, and it's both an exciting time to be alive, but also a profoundly important time to be alive, and we all have a critical role to play in this transition. Next slide, please. You know, finance, I come out of the finance world, as you've heard, and I do think finance, and we're going to hear a lot about this today, really plays a pivotal role in this. And, you know, this is kind of the conventional picture looked at through the lens of a financier. We sit on top of the economy, we allocate capital to projects and businesses that show the most promise for return. And the economy, the businesses, the government then sits on top of this planet and extracts resources that it needs, whether those are natural resources or human resources. Next slide, please. But of course, any kindergartner will tell you that there's something profoundly wrong with this picture. Next slide. The truth is, I think we've got this exactly inverted. Next slide, please. And what we need to do is reimagine a financial system in service to an economy which is in service to life. I outlined my thoughts on this in a book back in 2015 called Regenerative Capitalism, and it's really trying to see how the principles and patterns of living systems, which are the systems that have sustained themselves over very long periods of time, actually can be applied and used as the design principles for the human economy. Next slide, please. The key thing about the regenerative economy and distinguishing it from the sustainability movement is that regeneration is the literal process of living systems. We're having this conversation today because our bodies, which are living systems, are literally regenerating at a cellular level all the time. And so the idea of sustainability is that it's a worthy goal, and we need to make the incremental progress from the left of our conventional degenerative system towards sustainability. But I believe the only way we will achieve sustainability is to flip into this holistic approach of natural system design and follow the process of other living systems so that sustainability can become the outcome of the system that we create. Next slide, please. In my booklet, I've outlined 8 principles. I won't go through those here today, but these are derived from a study of living systems applied to an economic paradigm. They're issues like right relationship. In living systems, all parts of the system work in symbiotic relationship with each other. Empowered participation, the idea that in a healthy system, including in our bodies, all parts of our bodies need to be empowered to participate in the health of the whole, otherwise the whole suffers. And the other one's robust circulation, that's where the circular economy comes in, et cetera. And again, if you're interested, you can go and read all about it on our website at capitalinstitute.org. Next slide, please. The key takeaway on that, though, is that it's applying living system science to our human economy on the assumption that the human economy needs to behave like a living system. Now, if we now zoom down to the finance and investment world, I've laid out the various, kind of primary components that we think about and hear about when we talk about sustainable finance on this same spectrum, from conventional degenerative on the left to regenerative on the right. And our conversation today is going to focus primarily on the sort of yellow to green zone toward the middle. There's very little truly regenerative finance happening yet that I'm aware of. So we're actively engaged in this shift from being degenerative to being restorative and regenerative on the right. And you'll hear particularly about place-based integrated capital, which is pretty much at the leading edge of what's happening in the real world today. But let's not lose sight of the fact that there's big opportunities much further to the right than anything that we can experience and be involved in today. And I'll touch briefly on that in a second. Next slide, please. We're not going to talk about agriculture, but I'm personally very passionate about the opportunity and the necessity to transform our agriculture system. And here's one project that I'm personally involved in as an investor. It's a company called MyLand. You can find them at myland.ag. And they've taken the research in algae and applied it not just to energy, which is where we hear about it most, but applied it to soil science and soil health. And with the use of extracting algae from a farm, so it's indigenous algae, growing it in a container on the farm, and then recirculating it into the irrigation system, they have proven that you can actually, essentially the algae acts as food for all the organic matter in the soil. And they've shown that they can reverse the degradation of soil and actually grow soil while releasing many of the minerals and nutrients in the soil that had previously been bound up and not available for plants. This also reduces water needs, which is critical in places like the Southwest. And amazingly, as we know, the growth of soil sequesters carbon. So this actually turns large-scale farmland back into the soil, the carbon sink that it was designed to be. So it's accelerating the living system process in the soil while allowing us to grow food. Next slide, please. Now, where this is all headed, I don't know. But we have to take note of what's going on the blockchain and with cryptocurrency. And I would just very briefly say that, what we see in the news about Bitcoin, to me, it's kind of like when the internet started, most of the application at the very beginning was pornography. And Bitcoin is to blockchain what pornography was to the internet. And I believe the blockchain and cryptocurrency and the tokenized economy is going to fundamentally reinvent the way we think of finance. And that's a very exciting prospect so that we can incentivize values beyond simply financial return in a very creative way. Next slide, please. You'll notice if you study modern technology that the principles of open source software that are listed here in a very rough way on the right very interestingly line up with the principles of regenerative economics. And the other thing you'll notice if you study indigenous wisdom in particular, but all of the world's wisdom traditions, is that these principles very much line up with the values of our wisdom traditions that have stood the test of time. So I think the compass is getting clearer on where we need to head, and the challenge is, next slide please, how we actually put this into practice and make the rubber meet the road. And fortunately, we've got three folks that are wrestling in the real world, making this happen every day in their own context. And I'm happy to now introduce the first of our panelists, Susan Kidd. And if she would come on so that I can introduce her. Hello, Susan.
Hello.
Susan is the Executive Director of the Center of Sustainability at Agnes Scott College. She coordinates with partners across the campus to implement the college's plan for climate neutrality by 2037. Now, there must be a reason why it's 2037 instead of 2035, but we'll push her toward 2035. Previously, Susan was Emory University's first sustainability scholar in residence. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you. And I also have slides if you want to start the slides. Thanks so much. And thank you to Southface for inviting me and via me, Agnes Scott College, to be with you today. Also, thanks to the panelists for including a history major with a background in environmental law on a finance panel. Sometimes we are learning the words for what we do in sustainability at Agnes Scott, and now we are grateful to find out we're participating, and I think we soundly are, in the regenerative economy. To bridge quickly from that, before I talk about our specific tool, educational institutions in general are known for being places where systems thinking is important. So it's often instinctual for the staff, faculty and students, the team that came together to do sustainability at Agnes Scott, I think, to see ourselves that way, and often not even make that decision, but just make it happen. But I would argue that same type of thinking could happen in any sector, in any location. And for us, some of those principles are that we always think long-term about what we're doing. We're not looking for short-term gains. We're looking for the long-term. We think in terms of continued use. So we have about 100 acres with 1 million square feet, most of which is pre-1960 buildings. So we're actually in this using what we have at the footprint we have. So that makes a difference in our systems thinking. And we've always thought efficiency first. I learned that from Southface in my previous career. So we're thinking first about what we can do to maximize efficiency on campus, and then move into other venues like renewable energy, so that whole systems thinking of combining the economy, equity, and the environment is really important for us. So I'll take my first slide. So in that context, the tool that we're going to talk about comes out of the Center for Sustainability at Agnes Scott, where our mission is to provide the place for the whole Agnes Scott community and the surrounding community to learn about the challenges of climate change, including climate and environmental justice, and to find collaborations that are innovative for solutions both on campus and off campus. So the next slide, please. So the specific tool that comes out of that overall systems thinking, comes out of that mission for the Center for Sustainability, is a green revolving fund. So you may have heard that term before. I'll talk very specifically about how ours works. But basically, we set up this fund for these purposes: to establish an internal pool of funds that are dedicated to water and energy efficiency. Of course, to save utility costs, that is what happens when you do efficiency, but we're putting those savings back into the fund for reinvestment. So we're always looking for projects that will give us that reinvestment potential. So that gives us this long-term sustainable funding source that ties back to our climate neutrality efforts. And then we really wanted to find a tool, a financing tool, a regenerative tool that would strengthen our institutional capacity for building upgrades. So we want the campus to be more energy efficient. We want to save utility funds, but we really want to build capacity. We want to see ourselves as a place that's thinking ahead in terms of the assets that we have in our buildings and making sure that they have a long-lasting impact. And then last, but definitely not least, and I think this is part of any of the 3 E's that are talked about, people are always at the center of this thinking. So we wanted to really involve our community in efficiency and in climate neutrality, so that it was not just sustainability or just facilities doing this work, but that the whole Agnes Scott community was part of it. So next slide. So, so to establish this fund, so we, I always say when people ask me how long it took to do this, to set up this fund, it took from the day we started sustainability at Agnes Scott, because you really do, when you get into these more detailed tools, whether it's constructing solar arrays in your setting, setting up financing, you don't do that on day one. You need some early sort of set the groundwork with some early wins to sort of prove your approach, your systems thinking, your regenerative economy approach, and then eventually move into the more complicated tools. Once we got that grounding, then the next thing to establish a fund like this is to get leadership support. So we're really fortunate all the way to our president, but what was key to the leadership for us was the chief financial officer and our trustee finance committee. So they were involved at an educational level, like, here's a tool, what do you think of it? Is it something that we could do at Agnes Scott? So that leadership component is critical. And then next was the community support, which relates back to this idea that this would not be one facet of the institution, but truly embraced by everyone. And particularly the educational model piece of this, which again, clearly needs to happen on a college campus, but could happen in other settings as well, where we started to have faculty asking us if they could place interns in the office, the Center for Sustainability, to work on this. So it diversified our intern base. We'd had more typically physics, art because of architecture, chemistry, etc. But now we started getting math, econ, business management interns in the office to work on the fund. So lastly, on establishment, that group, the leadership and the community led us to set up a committee that set the guidelines for the fund. And they made certain decisions. There are more than these, but to point out that it would be donor initiated. So we would start out with funds that were donations, not with capital funds already in the college's budget. We would get new funding, that it would be water and energy focused. Some green revolving funds divert to other types of sustainability projects, which would be fine, but ours is very focused on these that have projected returns, and that we would base it on projected savings. That starts to get in the weeds, but people always want to know about that. So instead of actual savings, we take each project and we project what the savings are going to be, and we move those funds from our utility budget to the green revolving fund. So next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview, just so you know. We're happy to be transparent and share our information, but we have with our donor funds and our savings, and our costs, you see, have meant that we've invested and revolved about $2 million. I always used to say to our CFO, the only good zero net I've ever seen is in a green revolving fund, because you actually do want to spend the money, because you know that's what's going to bring the money back. So we've actually had a couple of large projects and we've been recouping those for a while. So we're now back at a net that we're starting new projects. So next slide. And we think of this as like a portfolio. This is our CFO who started this with sustainability, who's retired now, always called it a portfolio. And that we've got projects that are inexpensive and pay back quickly to projects that are much more expensive and pay back for the long term. But when you combine all that and you look at the projected annual savings, then the payback it comes closer to 6 years and a really good return on investment of about 17%. So next slide. And this one I won't go over, but just to show, this is sort of a worksheet of what we do. And this is our current worksheet of where we're looking at what are our projects on the left hand, what's the cost with any rebates subtracted, what are the savings, the payback, etc. That next to the last column is very important to our office. That's where we're reducing our carbon footprint by using this program. And then the right column just shows how the committee, either in meetings or via email, is sort of constantly reevaluating and voting on the projects. So next slide. So just to give a couple of examples that are sort of two ends of the spectrum, we just have done our outdoor lighting, which when I started in my job and then we started the fund, the company that does these outdoor lights that are redundant across college campuses nationwide had almost no way to replace them with a higher efficiency lamp. So then they came up with a sort of awkward way to do it. Then they came up with a more nimble but expensive way to do it, and eventually they got to where they are now. So sometimes waiting on technology is part of your thinking about things from a regenerative point of view. So we've just finished this project replacing the 130 of these with an estimated 80% energy reduction. The project cost was so much lower than where we would have thought it was going to go years ago. And so we're saving, obviously, that projected savings for several years until we pay this back, but we're also saving our facilities folks from this sort of constant replacement of the bulbs that were in these, both in terms of staff and material. And then on the opposite end of the sort of scale, we've done 2 geothermal HVAC projects, both with buildings that we were renovating. And when we renovate, we try to go really deep on energy efficiency while we're doing it, because we have no new construction. So, and I think I can wrap up there.
Oh, terrific. You sure?
Yes, I mean, I may have one more slide where they can show us. Oh yes, one more. So what's the future of this regenerative fund? So last year the college did a campus master plan that included sustainability at the core, but also went beyond it. But now we have this list of all of our deferred maintenance and all our building conditions assessments, and we're looking at integrating the outcomes from that plan into using the green revolving fund. So, and then for us, what's really important about what we do is always environmental justice and climate justice, and this fund allows us to think through that lens as well. So that's truly my wrap up, John.
That's great, Susan. Thank you. And with a couple more years of track record under your belt, you can take your 17% internal rate of return over the endowment department and ask if they'd like to invest the entire endowment with you, which would be truly holistic and fitting. So our next panelist is Matthew Hickman. Matthew's with the DC Green Bank, and he's an investment associate where he evaluates, structures, and executes green finance deals as part of the investment team, with a focus on building inclusive prosperity in DC's historically underserved communities. So Matthew, take it away.
Hi, thanks, John, for the introduction. Really great to be here, coming to you from DC, but back home in a manner of speaking. So thank you all for having me. I'm from Savannah, Georgia, and was recently back down visiting family in the area. So really excited about the Southface mission and what everyone's doing there. And so interesting to hear about the work that's going on in Agnes Scott as well, and some of the LED lights that are being replaced. It's such a home run. We're currently in the district studying that and different proposals that are out there for us to try and replace all of our lights with LED lighting. The savings are there, and it really just makes a lot of sense. Just to tell you a little bit about myself in the bank, if we could go to the next slide, please. And actually, we'll skip forward one more. So the DC Green Bank, we're a new organization. We were established in 2018 under the leadership of Mayor Bowser and the City Council. It was really in conjunction with a broader initiative that was established to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in the district by 2032, while also transitioning to complete renewable power by 2032, mainly through the purchase of renewable energy credits in the short term, but also by deploying a lot more renewable energy and energy efficiency. And we also have a longer term goal of reducing those emissions by about 80% by 2050. And so we were established with initial capital base to really help further that goal of meeting the emissions reduction targets, of increasing the deployment of renewable energy, and to find projects that in particular in corners of the market that commercial finance might not be able to serve yet. And so we could occupy that gap and accelerate the deployment of private capital to really meet those goals that we have. And as John mentioned at the outset, we certainly have a couple of different priorities. If we could go to the next slide, please. And among them is the one that he mentioned of inclusive prosperity. Making sure that we're taking into account the centuries of inequity that we have to confront in building a regenerative economy, and deploying our resources appropriately as a response to that. So we, in particular in the district, are focused on underserved wards of the district, specifically 7 and 8. But we have financing and projects available in all parts of the district, and including beyond the borders of the district, as long as some of those benefits are flowing back to the district and its citizens. But we also have two other priorities that you see listed on the slide here. So making sure that we're supporting a clean economy, generating good paying jobs is part of this transition, and sustainability, making sure that the solutions that we're putting in place are going to work for the natural world for the long run. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we have a couple of different focus areas at DC Green Bank. Solar power is a really robust sector within DC. We have really high renewable energy credit values compared to a lot of other places. And that is in large part due to the really aggressive targets that we've set for ourselves. But we also have priority focus areas in green buildings and making sure that we're becoming more efficient in the way that those buildings operate. Clean transport as well. It's more of a burgeoning sector that we're starting to try and increase the deployment of EVs in. But the one that I want to talk about today is stormwater resilience and some of the unique issues that the district faces related to stormwater resilience, and one of the policy tools that we've been able to develop in order to help address that with the deployment of private capital in an effective way that's going to lead to really a decrease in that problem in the coming years. So if we go to the next slide, please. Stepping back for a minute and just talking about the district's waterways in general and the Anacostia and the Potomac, they're very polluted, and they have been for a long time. So swimming has been banned in DC waterways since 1971, and the Potomac was once called by the New York Times an open sewer, calling itself a river. Fortunately, we've made a lot of progress since then, but we still have a long way to go. And the reasons for that are multiple. Some of that is pollution that's coming from further upstream outside the district, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that the district is 43% impervious. So we think about all the concrete, all the asphalt, all the built environment that's here. What that means is that a single 1.2-inch storm can generate over 500 million gallons of runoff, right? And so we have a pretty robust sewer system here in the district, but it does have overflow issues. And so when we see that happening, when all that water isn't captured, it goes directly into these rivers. And what that means is that we see oil, trash, pet waste, fertilizer, anything you can think of that would be out in the streets of the city, is then going directly into the river. In addition to that, it can also erode the riverbanks, expose trees and their root infrastructure, and really just endangers the entire watershed area. And so it's a big problem that we have that we're taking active steps to try and address. And I'll tell you a little bit about that on the next slide. And the policy tool that DOEE, our Department of Energy and Environment, has invented to try and address this is the stormwater retention credit. And so what we see here on the map is the two different sewer systems that serve the district. The gray is part of the integrated or combined sewer system is what we call it, and that's managed by DC Water. The green is part of what we call the municipal separate storm sewer system, or MS4 for short, since that's a mouthful. And really what we find is that green portion of our sewer system, it receives 2/3 of the runoff in the district, and that an entire retrofit of it would be quite expensive. And so when we think about short-term ways to address this problem, one of them is to build green infrastructure, right? So we have all of this impervious surface within the district. What if we replace some of that with more trees, more landscaping? Not only would that reduce runoff and absorb rainwater, it'll reduce the urban heat island effect that we experience in the city in the summertime, and it has the ancillary benefit of making things more pretty, which no one hates. So, I think that it's a win-win, and the question is, how do we incentivize the deployment of more green infrastructure? So what the City Council did is they invented a policy tool called the SRC, that for every gallon of stormwater that is retained for a period of 1 year by a green infrastructure project, they will grant a stormwater credit. And new buildings, and this is a really important part of the process, have to meet certain stormwater retention guidelines whenever they're building or being constructed. And so they have two options for that. They can integrate that directly into their plans, or they can purchase them on the open market that's been created as a result of this product. And the DOEE sets a floor. And so effectively right now that's at about $2 per SRC. And when we think about what that does from a financing and a bankability perspective, and how it allows the DC Green Bank to get involved, that revenue stream, once we have estimates of what the stormwater retention of a green infrastructure product is going to be, that allows us to get involved and finance that revenue stream. And so what I have on the next slide, if we can go to that really quickly, is an example of some statistics from a project that we're in the process of finishing closing, so I can't actually disclose it yet, but I can give you a few stats about it that we recently financed that's going to result in, you know, the preservation or planting of about 200 trees in Ward 7 and 8 over about 10,000 square feet. And the stat that I was most impressed by about this project is that it's going to mitigate over 200,000 gallons of runoff from flowing into the district's waterways per storm. And so from our perspective, when we think about getting involved with that kind of project, that's very aligned with our goals. That's absolutely what we want to be doing. And so we were really excited to be able to come in with this counterparty and back this project and provide the capital that, you know, a lot of developers of green infrastructure don't have up front. And so we're able to finance that over the term of the period of time that they're going to be receiving those SRCs. And so you can see the total project capital there was about 1.3 million. So we see projects like this as integral to tackling the challenges that we face with stormwater runoff in the district. And when you think about this in conjunction with other efforts that are going on with things like the construction of the Northeast Boundary Tunnel, which is actually, you know, being constructed right outside my front door here, wakes me up sometime in the mornings, but I'm glad that they're doing it. You know, when we think about this as a portfolio of actions that's taking place, what we can anticipate is that over a period of time, in the next 5-10 years, we might actually get to a point where the Potomac and Anacostia rivers are restored to their place, their previous state of, you know, being fishable, being swimmable. Right, this would have sounded a little crazy a few years ago, but it doesn't seem so crazy now. And in fact, the Anacostia River received its first passing grade from the Anacostia Watershed Society after a decade of failing grades in 2018, and then received its highest grade in 2020. So, you know, we see the path, and we're excited about being part of it. And, you know, I just want to say thanks again to the Southface team for having us, and look forward to taking the audience's questions.
Great, Matthew, thank you. That's exciting. I think the getting people attached to the story of a fishable river would certainly be a great way to motivate collaboration. Okay, so next up, last but not least, is Southface's own Barry Coates. Barry's been with Southface for about 3 years, and previously he's the Chief Financial Officer of Southface, and previously he spent most of his career in strategy and operations consulting with a focus on finance and accounting. Additionally, he's worked in investment banking and a technology startup. So Barry, tell us what Southface is up to.
You got it. Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. I think can everybody see me? Got my webcam? There you go. Share my webcam. Okay. Hey guys, full disclosure, my slides are not nearly as pretty as everyone else's. I'm an accountant by trade, so I did the best I can to put these together. So what you've just seen are some pretty impressive looking slides, but I'll try to make it as interesting as I possibly can. Next slide, please. So when we here at Southface, when we think about the regenerative economy, we tend to think of it as on a continuum. Like, so if you go to the far left there, you've got very energy inefficient. It's not even about clean energy or regenerative economy. It's really just about being very energy efficient and energy inefficient. And the way we think about getting there is it's through the continuum of kind of a step process, if you will. So energy efficiency is sort of the first step. Then you go to clean energy. Well, energy efficiency is less consumption. Then you get to clean energy, where you consume more clean energy. You get to carbon neutrality, and then you really get to where you're in a regenerative production, where you actually are contributing more than you're pulling out of the economy. So we sort of step through that process. Next slide, please. And how we stumbled on sort of the things we're working on right now is we have this program that's been in place for a long time called Good Use. Some of you that are familiar with Southface have probably heard of the program, but what Good Use does is it partners with other nonprofits to effectively help them become more resource efficient. A lot of the nonprofits out there devote the majority of their their money to their mission, right? So what they end up in is they end up in buildings that are not as resource efficient as they possibly could be. So we partner with them to kind of upgrade their facilities. And what we found is that, you know, we get somewhere in probably just a little north of an ROI of over 20%. And we tend to have an average annual reduction in the resource costs of up to about 30% in these nonprofits that we partner with. And that's just going through and retrofitting the buildings that they exist in, doing, you know, upgrades on equipment, things like that. And we found as we worked on these projects for the last 10 years, the majority of our partners wanted to continue down that continuum I showed you. They said, you know, this is great. We went from being energy inefficient to energy efficient, but we'd really like to get to clean energy, even carbon neutrality if we could, or, you know, but, you know, but we're struggling with how to get there, right? So next slide, please. So the hurdles they were facing, you know, are things like cost of clean energy too high. The ROI just wasn't there for them, right? The amounts that they were paying in power, while it may have been high for small business standards, were still cheaper than the investment that they would have had to make to actually try to get to clean energy. Most of the capital they just invested in these projects were for energy upgrades, right? So they were going, well, we'd have to raise more money, or we have to push this down you know, kick the can down the road a little bit. And there was no way to really leverage any of these federal programs or other investments. They were nonprofits, so they couldn't tap the tax credits. They couldn't tap private investment. There were just certain things that they couldn't do. So as we started putting that together, we got together with several other people that are friends of Southface, people far smarter than I am, and we got together and said, okay, how can we actually try to solve this problem? How can we take a nonprofit and get them from being energy efficient to clean energy, in hopes that we'll continue down the continuum of to the regenerative economy? Next slide, please. So what we started to do is we put a financing structure together, and it's a lot more detailed, more complicated than this, and I'm happy to answer questions around it. But what we did was we started to figure out ways that we could actually access the tax credits. So in, you know, the federal tax credits this year is 26% for a solar project. The problem with a nonprofit tapping that is they're a nonprofit. You have to be a for-profit to actually access those. And then we found that there were lots of sources of private investment, if you will, friends of the nonprofit, friends of Southface, friends of clean energy, if you will, that really wanted to try to help support these projects and do them at what I like to call a friendly rate of return, right? It wasn't a, here's money, just take it, and let's just give you money for your clean energy. It was, we'd like to support this, but we'd also like to do it from a friendly rate of return, sort of a guaranteed rate of return. So we started to find a lot of interest in there as well. And then we started to find a lot of interest in philanthropic funding, right? Not just, again, a grant check that said, hey, I'm going to grant you $100,000 for your project, but creative ways that that funding could be returned to the foundation, or that there were certain, lack of a better term, sort of operational criteria that was tied to that. And we started to bundle all this together, and what we've been able to do is figure out a construct that actually taps those three different sources to provide clean energy to the non-partners. And typically what happens is they then, you'll see the arrow for the payment. The payment goes back because they essentially pay for the electricity that's being generated from those solar projects, but they pay the construct back versus paying the utility. And what that does, that money then goes back to pay the private investment back. It goes back to kind of create a green revolving loan, as Susan talked about, with the philanthropic funding, so we can do more of these types of projects. And then somewhere around year 10 to year 12, maybe a little bit later, depending on how the economics work out, the assets then get flipped to the nonprofit, so they actually own the solar project. So, you know, for those of you out there, you'll listen to this and you'll say, oh, this sounds like a SEPA. Well, that's exactly what this is. It's a solar energy procurement agreement here in the state of Georgia. In other states, they're referred to as a purchase power agreement. But the difference is the way we access the different types of capital to create the stack. And then we do is we actually partner with a nonprofit to figure out an exit strategy. So we're not in the long-term game of actually owning these assets. We're trying to get the nonprofit to a point where they can continue down that continuum to the regenerative production, and then eventually own the assets themselves. So that's sort of how we're putting all this together, and the approaches that we're taking as an organization to kind of get us down that path. And that's my presentation. That's all I have. So I know I'm running really short, but that's all I've got.
Here I am. There. Thanks, Barry. Well, that was great. I you're sort of the model of what I would call integrated capital, which is doing the hard work of finding the place for the different pieces in our somewhat disjointed capital system to all be able to play in a sandbox together. So
Yeah.
I guess the nonprofits that you're dealing with are large, established nonprofits that are going to be in a big building for a long period of time, as opposed to, you know, the smaller, more nimble ones. Is that the idea?
Absolutely, yeah. We are partnering with, you know, names that are across, that are kind of a national brand, if you will, and local ones as well. You know, local to the region, local to the state. So we're finding a lot of interest in it. You know, the challenge is getting the capital stack lined up. That's the challenge with it, right? It works if you can get that lined up, but it's interesting because as we've had these conversations, people go, get it, it makes perfect sense, and then they'll say, well, can you really do that? And we'll say, yeah, sure we can. And then it becomes, okay, is this real? Can we get the capital lined up to do this? And we've done it for a couple now, but you know, we find lots of interest. A lot of people want to do this.
Yeah, I remember sitting on a panel a couple of years ago where this woman was going through, it was totally different, but exactly the same, you know, bringing together, in that case, I think it was the World Bank and a foundation and a bank, and trying to meet each of their somewhat narrow box constraints on how they release capital. It made my head spin, just listening to the story. So appreciate the patience on that. So let me start off with a couple questions, and then I see in the chat the questions are piling up. But for those of you out there in chat land, please do send in your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We do have plenty of time left, so that's good. Maybe I'd start going back to you, Susan, if I can. And you know, when we first met, I was intrigued with the revolving fund and its relationship to the endowment. And I said somewhat jokingly, but you know, we've now seen both in your case, Barry mentioned internal rates of return. I think, what did you say, Barry? Was it 18%? I think you just said.
Just a little bit of over 20. Yeah.
20%.
Yeah.
I mean, just to make sure everyone is sort of processing this, those are unheard of returns to generate on very little risk, because the technologies are proven, the counterparty is yourself, and these are project finances that that you can, you know, relatively easily pencil out with an Excel spreadsheet. And yet the world of investment somehow thinks that they can't align their capital with these projects because they're supposed to go out and buy stocks and bonds in a highly inflated stock market and a highly inflated bond market. So maybe if Susan, if you could just sort of share some of the inner workings, and don't tell us any secrets that'll get you in trouble, but you know, you met with the CFO, you met with some trustees. They're not stupid people. How is it that they had to create a donor-funded separate pool of capital to do this, rather than just start investing the endowment in these projects and be banging on your head to give them more?
Yes, right. Well, first I have to say, I love being on a panel where the World Bank and the stock market come up. You know, if we get the opportunity, we're happy to present in all those forums. But you know, I have to say that it's a lot of it is, and I think this is again probably not just true in higher ed or education. Different funds and different pieces of budgets are very siloed, right? So crossing over between the sort of operating budget and the endowment is a complicated process, really legally, in terms of legalities and accounting. And so that was really, you know, not to say it couldn't be done. And we do know in higher ed, there are some schools that do use their endowment, not very many.
No.
For their green revolving funds, but there have been a few, and I don't think anybody exclusively uses it. I think it's usually a combination of something like what we're doing. So that we were dodging the sort of reinvention of, taking away some of those boundaries, to be just totally honest. It was really more of a process decision than a financial. So it was definitely not that the team, including the leadership, didn't understand what you're saying. I mean, they certainly understand the value. So, and also we're a small school with a tight budget. And so we're always looking at ways to attract donors that would possibly not be donors to the college anyway. And so this has been a really attractive donor fund. Obviously, we've raised $1 million. I have to say, I should have said it earlier, Barry's program, it used to be called Grants to Green, now Good Use Grants. And we've been a very grateful recipient of multiple grants through that program. So part of that $1 million is that fund. So, so we wanted to make ourselves available to something creative like Good Use Grants, as well as to our donors. So
yeah, no, that bit I picked up on as I was listening to you. It is a great, it's better than building a new gym, and so that hopefully that would be a good fundraising excuse, if you will, which then becomes a perpetual opportunity. Matthew, I'm curious to learn more about the establishment of the bank and what that says to you. I mean, I guess the first question is, was it done out of the annual budget of the government? Like, was it like a grant to create the capital, to create the bank? And which I think is what happened, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So we have $100 million of capitalization that come as part of that legislation. And most of that comes from our renewable portfolio standard. And so, the way that it works, I don't think there's a rec market in Georgia at the moment. Perhaps the panelists already know, but for those who might not already be aware in the audience, we have these renewable portfolio standards that say you have to have certain percentage of renewables in your energy mix. And if you don't meet that as a utility, then you have an alternative compliance payment that you have to make. And so our revenue is drawn, or our capitalization was drawn from those payments that the utility, Pepco in this case, is making to meet that RPS.
Mm-hmm. But that's money that otherwise the government could have chosen to spend on something else. So it's government purse money. And I guess my question is, I'm just curious, now that you're in a sense in the weeds of doing the banking work, what is your observation about the need for a government-sponsored financial entity versus, the banking system provides massive subsidies to the banking industry already, federal subsidies. Most importantly, the no bank gets to fail, FDIC insurance, but also many others. There's it's extraordinary. And yet to get the work done at the $1 million project, kind of, where the rubber meets the road in real communities, it seems that it doesn't happen without a dedicated, focused institution like yours. And I'm just curious if you could maybe philosophize a bit about what's wrong with our banking system, or just acknowledge that we need a more of a hybrid system that that has a state chartered bank component to it, like countries like Germany have very successfully.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and I'm sure I could offer a lot of opinions, some more qualified than others. But when I think about the place that we occupy, and you compare us to a traditional banking system, I think that we're supposed to make projects happen that might not otherwise happen. And when you think about the goals of traditional finance, seeking returns on capital, as its kind of highest aim, usually it's only aim. I think what we're doing now, hopefully in the transition to a regenerative economy, is asking, what's the cost of that? should we maybe be thinking about other things? As you pointed out in your opening presentation, some of these other social ends, perhaps they're the main goal, not just a return on capital that has done tremendous damage to the economy and human society for a long, long time. That's not to say that it doesn't do some things really well. Obviously, it does. Creates a lot of wealth. But I think that green banks like ours are necessary because they occupy that space that traditional capital is not yet willing to occupy in many cases, although in many cases it is. And we have lots of private sector partners, I think, who have shown that willingness. And you do see that transition starting to happen. But we can supplement them by taking that riskier position when it's called upon. And talking about the scale, it was really interesting to hear that part of your question. We were having a really interesting conversation last week with the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, which is now headed by Tigger Shaw. Some in the audience may know, former host of Green Tech Media podcast. There's a lot of money out there right now, but ultimately it has to filter down to smaller entities like the DC Green Bay that can deploy it, because the tranches of capital that they were talking about deploying, it's $100 million, right? $1 billion. Yeah, and even within the green climate legislation that we see before Congress right now, there is funding for a national climate accelerator, effectively a national green bank that would basically fill the role that the DC Green Bank fills, but at a broader level. And we think that there's a great need for that. And the last thing that I'll say, because I know I'm going on here, is I think one of the attractive things about our model is that by taking that riskier position that we sometimes do, it allows us to not only make projects happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, but to multiply that with multiples of private capital. And I think that is hopefully an area of partisan agreement where we can find a way to really increase the capital being deployed in the private sector to further public aims.
Yeah. I just as a editorial comment, I think one of the things that has happened in our country, but to a lesser degree than other countries, is with the roll up and consolidation of the banking industry, we've essentially damaged think about the circulatory system in your body. You've got big arteries, you've got medium-sized veins, and you've got gazillions of capillaries. And that's essential to the circulation of oxygen in your body. And we've essentially destroyed the capillaries by consolidating the banking industry. And again, as a plug for using living systems as a framework, we know that if you destroy all your capillaries, you're not going to be circulating oxygen. So we're, in a sense, we have to recreate the place-based capillaries in order for this money to get from, where it's all consolidated in the middle down to the, into the communities where it's actually needed. And it's, and similar to the project Barry's working on, I mean, it's just lots and lots and lots of tedious hard work with relatively small projects, and all the big shots in finance say, well, that's, there's no scale there. And the reality is that the way we're going to scale this is to scale out zillions of quote small projects, as opposed to thinking that we can write a $1 billion check to somebody and it'll make the problem go away. Barry, I wanted to kind of drill down a little bit further on your work with these foundations. I've worked with foundations in my work, and I think the potential for foundations to be at the vanguard of this creative finance is enormous. And if you think about any pools of capital that are, not only ideally suited, but have a duty to be responsive to this, it would be the capital sitting in foundations. And yet we all know that foundations haven't been particularly aggressive and creative and out of the box thinking. And even some of the progress in impact investing is I made my first impact investment in 1997, so it's a little late to be, cheerleading for impact investing at this point. So I'm curious, from your experience working with foundations, do you see that moving faster, or what's wrong with the culture in foundations that we could address systematically so that they would actually be out on the leading edge of this rather than dragged kicking and screaming, if you will?
Yeah, great question. So, and this is just obviously my perception or my interpretation of things that are going on. So a lot of times foundations tend to be very transactional in nature, right? What they do is you go to them and you say, hey, I've got this idea, or you've asked for a proposal, and they write a check and they hand the money over, and then you report back on what's been done, right? And they have to kind of give out a certain amount of money every year, if you will, right? Where we've seen some traction is in these constructs called like PRI loans. And I always forget exactly what it stands for, but it's a way for a foundation.
Program related investment.
There you go. Thank you. Yeah, for some reason, I have a mental block. I always say PRI and I can't remember what it stands for. But it's, but the public related investments, what those allow foundations to do is actually invest, loan money at a way below market rate, right, for social good. And there's some criteria around that. What we're finding is that while foundations are open to that idea, they're not really set up to do that. They're not set up as a bank. So, while they have to essentially set up all the back office systems to be able to do, track the payment, calculate the interest, do all the things around it, right? But there is some traction, especially in the north, around that. But then we've also stumbled on other grant mechanisms that allow the recipient to actually repay the grant, right? And what we're finding is foundations are going, wait a minute, let me get this right. I can loan you the money at a below market rate because it's for social good, and you're going to invest it in something. And as Susan can attest, you see the ROI on that, and I can get the money back and do good and then sort of recycle the money again. When we have that conversation, a lot of the foundations are going, that's brilliant. That makes perfect sense. Like, we can kind of create this thing in perpetuity and keep it going for good versus let's write a check one time, hand it to you, and then, next grant, let's look at the next grant. Let's look at the next grant, right? So we're starting to see a lot of interest and traction there, but it's sort of a different way to think about a foundation.
Yeah, for sure. And I particularly like your comment about being transactional as opposed to relationship oriented. And again, I just make a plug for how living systems work. I often say that Goldman Sachs was a better partnership than it is a public corporation because it used to be a very relationship driven culture. And now, because of all the pressures of being a public company and with all the capital they have, and the rest of Wall Street has transitioned to be highly transactional. And that's clearly degenerative as opposed to regenerative.
Yeah.
So let me switch over and make space for our terrific audience. I've got a bunch of questions here. If you'll bear with me, I'm gonna have to read them. Hopefully I can do that. This first one is for Susan. If savings for green revolving fund projects are projections, does the college perform any analysis? Do you ever get checked on your projections? It's the question, I think.
Yes, an important question and an important thing to do. Yes, we do check ourselves. So the other interesting thing that's come out of this work is that we now have a much more rigorous tracking. Yeah, we always had tracking of our utilities, but now we have a monthly meeting. We actually have a outside consultant who works on a really small contract, but who does our tracking so that we have an outside set of eyes on it. And then we sit down with sustainability and facilities and go over it all. And as part of that, we are checking ourselves on our reductions. Again, this is not unusual just in our case, but we have combined metering for our electric bills. So we actually, some of our things we couldn't track to the equipment level, or even so we Matthew mentioned about LEDs. We've done all our LEDs campus wide. So, but we have to just look at that as a, full number campus across the whole campus electric bill. So I'm actually really, really glad on a regular basis we made that decision about projected savings, because there were a lot of things that would have tripped us up and slowed us down if we hadn't. So
yeah, well, and that's the way any financial investment decision is made, is on projections. So no reason
yes.
why you wouldn't do it as well, for sure.
Yep.
Matthew, here's one for you. Again, interesting, great question. Crowdfunding. I mean, the crowdfunding space is exploding in ways that I never imagined possible even a couple of years ago. But the question is, have you seen any crowdsourced funding for public infrastructure projects?
That's a fascinating question. And I have to say, I don't think I have. And, as soon as the question was asked, I asked myself, why not? So if it's out there, yeah, I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but I can't. It would be interesting to see how the response you would get from, it's almost like asking people to pay more taxes than they're obligated to. But if you could show that they'd get a return, and it was for something that they believed in, no reason why not.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it. I guess I just think, because these deals often take so much diligence that it might make it a little bit tough for people to log on a Kickstarter and contribute. Right. But
well,
maybe
I got to tell you, I'm involved in something with a company, and the amount of diligence that some of the organizing platforms are doing is getting to be quite sophisticated. So it's moved. It's not just, hey, here's a cool company, throw your money at it. So let me ask you another question, Matthew. And again, this is a really important question. Can you elaborate on how the 100% clean energy goal is advancing prosperity and equity for the frontline communities in DC?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, there are probably a few different examples I could give, but the one that immediately pops into my mind is making sure that the air that we are breathing is cleaner. I think it's pretty well documented that in cities with a lot of pollution, you have higher rates of asthma in children, and the district I don't think is any exception to that. And so by hastening the speed with which we make it to 100% renewables, we're going to make a real impact in even kids' lives and the air that they breathe.
Yeah, for sure. And this one is really for everybody. But maybe Barry, if we can, ask you to start. There's, the audience are all individuals. Well, I don't know that for sure, but I assume most of them are here in a capacity as an individual, and they might have a 401k savings plan or some money in the bank. And the frustration of all of these, the whole sustainable investment conversation is the lack of agency that individuals have with their own money. And, it somehow doesn't feel that rewarding to take it out of Citibank and put it in your local community bank, even though that's a good thing to do. So do you see an opportunity for individual investors to co-invest? Like, imagine there was a vehicle that Southface could set up for individual investors to literally just co-invest with the foundations who are going to earn this quite attractive return on projects that are vetted and structured by Southface.
Yeah, absolutely. I've sort of just started to push the boundaries around it and tried to figure out exactly what the regulatory hurdles would be around that. But absolutely, I mean, we've partnered with a couple people who've put in, and I wouldn't say it's a nominal amount, but it wasn't, hey, let me put in half my savings to invest in these. And we've done is we've structured these almost like a guaranteed rate of return from like a, lack of a better term, a CD or money market, but it's a very decent rate of return. I mean, it's 3 to 5%. for over 10 years, right? So it's not 3% at the end of 10 years, it's 3% annual for over 10 years, which is pretty darn good when you think about not a risk-free investment, but a pretty darn close to risk-free investment.
Yeah.
You know, and we're even pushing the boundaries a little bit. I'm going to just throw this out here, and you guys will probably think I'm the craziest person on this call, but could you actually create a crypto type currency based on energy efficiency investments, right? Could you do something like that? Like, you know, you'd asked me 10 years ago about Bitcoin, I would have said that's the craziest thing I'd ever heard of, right? But look at the success of those types of things, and could you create something for environmentally minded, sustainability minded individuals to create something similar based on carbon, you know, reduction or based on energy efficiency? But, you know, there's definitely is a mechanism for individuals. Could we crowdsource that? That's where we get into some, you know, regulatory hurdles about what type of investor are you, and that kind of stuff. And I'm kind of poking around that. I've just started early looking into that. But for an individual, it's pretty straightforward. But to aggregate, it gets a little more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, for those interested, there is, I'm sure there's more than I'm aware of, but there is an interesting token crypto platform called Seeds, which is targeting, in a sense, carbon and environmental projects. So that world is opening up for sure. How about the other, Matthew and Susan, any thoughts on how individual investors could participate?
I'll just jump in sort of two ways along with what Barry's saying. It just really strikes me how, especially for the nonprofit sector that I've worked in all my career, higher ed included, you know, we don't have the internal ability to think through these creative models that go beyond, you know, one of the reasons we've done our green revolving fund as we have is because it was within the scope of what we knew how to do, you know, and even then it was a bit of a, you know, out there, you know, there are plenty of schools that have decided not to do it. So, so partnership is critical in this idea realm. If we're going to, and we've often thought, not only is it a good idea to find the way to gather donor or to gather investors, you've got ready-made people that support different issues in the nonprofit sector. So it's not like we don't have to go look hard for them. They're there. It's just this, you know, as Barry has said, what are the financial and legal issues? So I'm really grateful that Southface has become that sort of gap filler right now between the thinking about financing and all. And the other piece, I can't not say this out loud if any of my fundraising team are listening, donations are always welcome. I mean, and we, it's not the same thing, but you do get a charitable contribution for a donation. I mean, sometimes when we've talked about, as Barry said, like it's said often you leave the solar tax credits on the table if you're a nonprofit, but I would say, you know, if you do it with a donor, there's the charitable contribution tax credit. And so you're not leaving everything on the table. So, and it's been real for us. I mean, those donors, we have some alums, primarily alums, but a couple of off-campus people that have donated to the Green Revolving Fund, not because they were getting that return yet, but so it's a viable model for the interim, I think. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Matthew, unless you have something urgent to say, I'm going to move to the next question because we're going to run out of time.
I'm going to say two things quickly what the individual investor can do. Look at the ESG scores of the funds that you're investing in or the companies that you're investing in, and see what you can do in your local community, whether you're in DC or somewhere else. You know, in DC, rec values are so high that as an investment, installing solar on your roof, it is absolutely a no-brainer. There are things like that in most people's communities, and see what's out there no matter where you are.
Beautiful, beautiful. Where'd that question go? Bear with me, I had it. Another one, Barry, for you and Southface, since you're our hosts. What is Southface doing to involve more organizations and leaders from the communities of color who are disproportionately affected by climate change and pollution? Has your organization thought about how to include them?
That is another great question, and unfortunately one that I am probably not the best person to answer. Right, what I can tell you is that Andrea Pinnabell, our president, our development team, our community impact team, are always looking for opportunities to partner and to figure out how to further the impact. You know, and in my role, I'm sort of more behind the scenes in the operations and the finance behind things, but I do know that part of our mission at Southface is to you know, further, or just like a better term, move the needle on those efforts, right? But again, I would probably be going a little bit over my skis if I even tried to attempt to answer that in any kind of meaningful way, so I apologize.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Last question for all of you. You know, and this question comes from me as well. I mean, I would be delighted to find, you know, regenerative investment opportunities that generate 10, much less 20% returns. So why isn't this scaling faster, and how can we change that? Is it that people don't know about it, or you're all too busy to tell them about it, or what's the deal?
I mean, I can take a crack at that first if you're okay with it. So I think what we're finding is that, you know, a lot of times, like we focus solely on the nonprofit space, right? So the nonprofit space isn't always the most, it's probably not front and center a lot on the radar of commercial type entities looking for what I call a commercial grade return, right? But there are interesting, you know, participants in this area. I mean, Truist now, Bank of America, a lot of these major banks have investment arms that go in and they do this type of lending, right? Where they go into, but it's mostly commercial entities, because what they're looking for is a commercial level rate of return. That's what kind of drives some of this down. While you see the ROI is typically not captured by the investor, or in lack of a better term, like the Southface, the entity that's doing it for good. A lot of that ROI is maintained by the entity that's receiving the benefits, you know, the Agnes Scotts of the world. And that doesn't really work in a pure capitalistic model. At least that's my opinion, right? Like that ROI, they want that captured. So instead of saying, well, you know, let's think about this and go, okay, I could tolerate a 10% return and you could keep 5%. It's mostly, whoa, I can keep the 15%. At least that's kind of what I'm seeing, you know.
That's the expression in finance of how do we extract value. So, any other final comments? I'm about to get the hook, I'm sure. So any other final comments from anybody?
I would just add to what Barry said and say that, you know, what I've seen so far in my experience in the sector is that the private capital is there where they can extract that value. You know, I think the renewable sector at a utility scale is a great example of that. You see the big banks coming in for tax equity investments in large projects, and that's why that sector is booming. But for the smaller projects that we've been talking about, you know, I think we have to further that ongoing conversation that I think today is part of you know, having a discussion about what our priorities are as a society. And once we do that and have a little bit of clarity on that, and hopefully get some more clarity around the policies that will be necessary to support a regenerative economy, then I think that the dollars might start to flow even towards those smaller projects more aggressively.
Great.
Yeah.
Susan,
No,
you get the last word, Susan.
Okay, well, I do think it's repetitive about the word I used before is partnership. I think is so critical because there may be things we're not even thinking about here. So, you know, what if a partnership combined a stream of employment for interns and students that was beneficial both for the corporate sector or the another sector and for higher ed, right? So that you're actually, there's some investment there, but there's also this long-term, to Matthew's point, like where's the value, where's the comprehensive value equation? So I think coming with a willing and open mind to think really creative about what investment means would be helpful in the nonprofit perspective, so.
Yeah, I'll just give a final plug. What you've just described in living systems is called the edge effect, where different systems come together. That's where there's greatest diversity, and that's where new life happens. That's where potential exists. So partnership is sort of a trite term, but it actually is highly aligned with how living systems create potential. And you know, when Matthew kicks over to the transportation bucket in his work, he's going to find huge potential when we no longer have everyone driving cars or owning their own cars, and parking lots are going to be freed up and roads are going to be freed up to turn back to abilities to absorb rainwater runoff. So the big potential lies at the edges of how we've structured in our siloed world our society. So I know I'm getting the hook now. Catherine, I trust you're out there somewhere. There she is. Did we make it?
Yeah, thanks guys. Thanks so much. What a great conversation. Thanks to John, Susan, Matthew, and Barry for sharing your experience and wisdom with us. I have just a couple announcements to say at the very end. So now I'll announce our selected at random Southface Professional Membership winner. And the winner is James Reichert. I think that's how you say your last name. Congratulations, James. And be on the lookout for an email from me to collect your prize. Next slide. Make sure to go check out our website, southface.org, for future events and to find online trainings on our learning platform. We hope to see you on July 9th for our next roundtable. Thanks, everyone.